Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. I've got about 60 slides and hope to speak for about 40 minutes. So let's get started. Okay, so Zionism was an ideology that stemmed from an ideology that was spreading around Europe in the 19th century called nationalism, which said that nations have the right to states. And so you had all these nationalist uprisings, for example, around the Ottoman Empire in places like Greece and Serbia and Bulgaria and Romania. You had the unification of the German and Italian states. And nationalists, they told stories about the nation's origin, its character, and historical triumphs. So, for example, the Bulgarians celebrated their independence from the Byzantines in 681. The Serbs memorialized the Battle of Kosovo in 1389. The French venerated Joan d'Arc's martyrdom in 1431. So it's looking back into the past, digging up these memories, these historical triumphs, and then welding together disparate populations into a single national core, into a single ethnic core that has an imagined homeland with a shared culture and a shared language and shared values and shared memories. Now, one of the key things to remember about Zionism is that actually many of the first Zionists were Christians, not Jews. You had Anthony Cooper publish a tract already in 1838. So we're talking half a century before there were any Jewish Zionists, claiming that, quote, Jewish restoration in Palestine would benefit Great Britain's geopolitical position, and it would hasten the coming of Jesus, the second coming of Jesus Christ. You had Charles Churchill propose a plan for establishing a Jewish state in Palestine in the 1840s. James Finn, who was the British consul in Jerusalem, he bought land in the 1850s in Palestine for the purpose of trying to employ destitute Jews there. And then you had William Heckler, an Anglican clergyman in 1884, write a book called The Restoration of the Jews to Palestine, in which he argued for the Jewish settlement of Palestine, and that would be a precondition for the return of Jesus Christ. So this is, you have Europeans, mostly in the UK, in England, talking about the Jewish settlement in Palestine as bringing about the second coming of Christ, owing to these eschatological beliefs that they had about the end of days. And then in the mid-19th century, you have a number of Jews strongly influenced by the nationalist movements in their own countries, also talking about a Jewish state in Palestine, such as the Serbian Rabbi Judah Alkali, perhaps the first Zionist, a Jewish Zionist at least, talking about a settlement project in Palestine that would also bring about the coming of the Messiah. So you have Jews also have eschatological beliefs and also believe that, and so you also have this new movement of Jews that believe that in the 19th century that that Jewish movement to Palestine will help bring about this end of days fantasy. The German philosopher Moses Hess says something similar. He says that that the Jewish return to Palestine will will solve the Jewish problem in Europe as it was known then, since the root cause of this problem was exile and detachment from the homeland. You had other Jews, again, like a German rabbi at Zvi Kalischer, saying that we should look after the Italians and the Poles and the Hungarians. Let's pay attention to what they're doing in their homelands. The Jews should do the same in Palestine. And then, of course, Theodor Herzl himself was an ardent German nationalist and a Germophile before he was a Zionist, and so was Max Nordau. They saw themselves as Germans first. And then I would also add that you had significant synergies between Jewish Zionists and Christian Zionists. So you have many American Christians studying the Holy Scriptures in the 19th century, the return, kind of the literalism movement, the return to studying the texts and the Scriptures themselves. And so they believe that the modern Jews of Europe were the descendants of the ancient Israelites to whom God promised the land of Palestine. And of course, they believed the Bible was the word of God. So if God promised the land of Palestine in the Bible, well, here we had the Jews in Europe who were promised the Holy Land. So this very much synced up with kind of European sensibilities. It also synced up well with European nationalist sensibilities who obsessed over their own ancient roots, as we saw in the previous slides. So the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, that's what the that's what Serbian nationalists talked about. So this idea that the Jews would return to some ancient place that they once lived in, this synced really nicely with European sensibilities around nationalism. And then the third point to make here is that Zionism also served as an instrument for European imperial expansion. If the Europeans were seen to be supporting these Jewish migrants to Palestine, then, and if the Jews were actually able to establish a foothold in Palestine, and the European states were seen as the backers of that movement, then that would have a second-order positive impacts for these European states that were looking to expand their imperial footprint in the Middle East. And then the final thing to say here is that the Muslims were not considered at all. The Muslims, the Arab population of Palestine, the indigenous people living in Palestine in the 19th century, they were considered backwards, they were considered uncivilized, and thus they were not deserving of things like national self-determination. Let's shift to Eastern Europe, where you have Christians massacring Jews in the thousands around Eastern Europe, in the Russian Empire, in places like Odessa, in Kiev, throughout the 1880s to the 1920s. And this drives a massive movement of Jews out of the Russian Empire, primarily to the United States. So you have 2 million Jews migrate to the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century. Only 30,000 migrate to Palestine. The obvious choice for European Jews was the New World, was primarily the United States. It was not Palestine. Jews were blamed for the assassination of the Russian Tsar in 1881. This leads to pogroms. You have hundreds of thousands of Jews in Eastern Europe who lose their means of livelihood, and you have scenes of pillage and murder, arson and rape, leaving thousands of Jews dead in these dozens and dozens of different pogroms around Eastern Europe in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Now I'd like to talk about an interesting marriage of convenience between the anti-Semites of Europe and the Zionists of Europe. So in 1878, for example, you have a Hungarian politician, Istoczi. He calls for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. Why? Because it's a solution to the Jewish problem, right? He's an anti-Semite. He thinks Jews are, they killed Christ. They're financiers. They control the world. They're having this. They're leeches. And so they need to be removed from Europe because they're a threat. And so he actually calls in 1882. Not only in 1878 he calls for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. In 1882 he proposes expelling the Jews of Hungary, and he becomes the leader, the spokesperson for the anti-Semitic movement in Hungary. In 1881, you have a German journalist, Wilhelm Marr, who actually popularizes the term anti-Semitism itself. He calls for sending all of world's Jewry to Palestine, where it could become a penal colony. You have German Emperor Wilhelm II, who is perhaps the second or third most powerful European leader at the time. He also supports Zionism because he believes that Jews are exploiting Christians in Europe, and so wouldn't it be great if they all moved to Palestine? And then perhaps the most famous the most famous Jewish Zionist, the most famous non-Jewish Zionist in all of history, Arthur Balfour, who was the Prime Minister of Britain in 1905, and who sponsored legislation to keep Jews out of Britain in 1905, at the time that they were being slaughtered in the thousands in Eastern Europe. He, of course, then goes on to embrace the Balfour Declaration, which is really the Britain's blueprint, its basis for its interwar policy of encouraging Jewish immigration to Palestine in the interwar period. So again, marriage of convenience between Zionism and anti-Semitism. Let's talk about Zionism's Eastern European origin. So you have these groups of Jews known as Hovevei Tzion, the lovers of Zionism, who found all of these clubs in various parts of Eastern and also Western Europe and Central Europe to teach Jews Hebrew, Jewish history, agricultural training. They helped Jews settle into Palestine, which we're going to obviously talk about later on in this presentation. And so you have dozens of these groups in places like Warsaw and Odessa, Vienna, Bucharest, Paris. Over 100 by 1890, over 200 by 1897, and totaling something like 20,000 members by the turn of the century. Let's shift to Western Central Europe. So in France, in the 1890s, the country is engulfed in a scandal around a Jewish captain named Alfred Dreyfus. He was a Jew who had risen to a position of influence in the French army, but was baselessly convicted of spying for Germany and sentenced to life in prison. And he served 5 years in prison before it was determined that he was unjustly accused, and it was an anti-Semitic accusation. And this had a huge impact on Theodor Herzl, who we're going to get to in just a minute, who was really the founder of Zionism. And he's a journalist based in Paris at the time and comes to the conclusion that, wow, Jews will never be accepted as equals in Europe. And that's really the turning point for Herzl, who, again, is he's a secular Jew born in Austria, sees himself as kind of, German and really is a German nationalist in the sense that he believes German culture is really the highest culture that there is. But then he sees what's happening to Jews in places like France, where they're not being treated as equals, they're not accepted in Europe. So he says the only solution to anti-Semitism is a Jewish state. And so he goes around Europe. He goes to the Ottoman Empire. He meets with the Sultan in 1896 and tries to buy Palestine from Sultan Abdulhamid II. Obviously, he fails to do that. And then he goes around to all these other European leaders, trying to get them to back the Zionist movement. He, of course, publishes his infamous Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, in which he says Jews will inevitably face persecution in Europe, and thus the only solution is to colonize another place. And we're going to get to that debate around where Zionists wanted to establish a Jewish state in just a minute. But he sees the Zionist project as creating this rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization in the barbaric East somewhere. That was his conception. So he establishes, he organizes the first Zionist Congress in Basel in Switzerland in 1897. The delegates are about half from Eastern Europe, half from Western Europe. And you could say this Congress really put Zionism on the map. It brings Zionism out of the shadows into the mainstream of Europe, of the European political map in the late 19th century. And as you well know, the Zionist movement was on a search for a homeland. Where should we establish a homeland? Initially, Herzl proposed a plan to the colonial secretary in Britain for Jewish settlement in Cyprus. And in 1903, the British colonial secretary Chamberlain proposed creating a Jewish homeland in portions of British Kenya. That was rejected. In 1891, the Jewish philanthropist Baron Maurice de Hirsch, he proposes establishing a Jewish Jewish settlement in places like Argentina or potentially Palestine, because Argentina was one of the most fertile countries in the world. Then you had a proposal to establish a Jewish state in Egypt, in North Sinai. And this proposal actually had legs. There was even a commission that was sent to North Sinai to try and establish, to try and investigate whether or not this was even viable. And then they determined that it was found the area would require 5 times as much water as had been first estimated. And so the idea was rejected, not just by the British in Egypt, but also by the Ottoman government as well. You had an idea to establish a Jewish state in Uganda. And here again, there was real movement, and there was an investigation that was sent in 1903 to see if this was practical or feasible. And in fact, Herzl brought this idea of establishing a Jewish state in Uganda before the Zionist Congress, the 6th Zionist Congress, which actually did vote in the positive on sending an investigatory commission to Uganda. But in the end, the proposal was vehemently objected to by many Zionist leaders who believed that for historical and religious reasons, the Jews had to establish a state in Palestine, not Uganda. And I think so. This is a quote from Menachem Ushishkin, who was a Russian Zionist leader and later became the head of the Jewish National Fund. And he explains, I think, in a really beautiful, concise way, kind of the 3 ways that Jews could establish a state in Palestine. The first was, right, by buying the land, was by purchasing it. The second was by force, was through conquest and war. And then the third was by government expropriation. So once you have the state, then you can just expropriate it. So it was either buying the land directly, conquering the land through war, or once you have a state, then you can expropriate it directly through governmental authority. And those were the 3 ways already in 1904 that Jews are talking about, the 3 strategies for how we're going to take over Palestine. Now I want to talk about a few different ideological strains within Zionism. So you have Max Nordau, who's kind of Herzl's right-hand man. He helps establish the first Zionist Congress in 1897. And he has this concept of kind of muscular Judaism, that the idea was to transform Jews from these merchants and these intellectuals, these weak people, into soldiers and farmers who are muscular. They cultivate discipline, agility, and strength. They're physically fit, they're deep-chested, sturdy, sharp-eyed. So his idea is to transform Jews, to really transform the essence of what it means to even be Jewish. He argues that Zionism awakens Judaism to new life, It achieves this morally through the rejuvenation of the folk ideas. So the idea that Zionists need to be tough is really, I think, an ideological thread that really extends all the way to the present day. And you can even kind of see this tough guy rhetoric, the genocidal rhetoric we've seen coming from almost every single Israeli political and military leader since October 7th. I do think that is a direct outgrowth of this concept of Jews need to be muscular and strong. And that is really a key, I think, ideological movement in Zionism. Then you have Achad Ha'am, who calls for a spiritual center in Palestine, more so focused on Jewish regeneration, especially the Hebrew language, national history, and he believes that the effort to achieve independence in the land of Israel would bring Jews into conflict with the native Arab population. So you actually did have some awareness already in the 1890s that there would be conflict if Jews tried to take over Palestine. Another key figure in this movement was Eliezer ben Yehuda, who revives the Hebrew language as a spoken language among the Jewish immigrants in Palestine. Really the mainstay of Zionism, really from the early 20th century onward, was labor Zionism. This idea that Jews need to, till the soil, they need to be workers, and and the idea of establishing a Jewish state would happen only through the Jewish working class, building a country through agriculture and industry. You have revisionist Zionists like Ze'ev Jabotinsky, who publishes his tract called The Iron Wall in 1923, basically saying that, look, Palestinian Arabs consider themselves indigenous to Palestine, and they consider Zionists foreign invaders. He wrote this in 1923, and he said, look, the Zionists could not possibly hope to reach a negotiated compromise with the natives. The only option was to take Palestine by force, hence the title of the book, The Iron Wall. Only once the Palestinians were convinced that the Zionist community was too strong to defeat would they acquiesce. And he believed that the Zionist movement should establish a state on both sides of the Jordan River, both what is today Israel-Palestine and also what is today Jordan. And this movement, the revisionist Zionists, this is really the movement that gave rise to the right wing in Israel today. First, the Herut Party in the 70s and 80s, and then which evolved into the Likud Party, the party of the current Prime Minister of Israel, Bibi Netanyahu. And that party, by the way, in 1977 adopted a platform calling for the establishment of a Jewish state describing the platform of this political party, Likud, as Israel, defining Israel as between the river and the Jordan. There will only be Israeli sovereignty, and that platform is still the platform of the Likud party today. You have Zionism. Also, you have a movement. I would call it kind of like a racial science within the Zionist movement, where there's this belief that Jews are kind of a racial movement. Recall that racial science is kind of all the rage in the late 19th century, and the Jews very much see themselves as a race, especially the Zionists. They want to believe that Jews are this unique race, just like all of these other races. There's another interesting strain within the Zionist movement, which is that the self-conception of the movement is as a colonial movement. So you have Arthur Rupin, born in Poland, and he sees the German Colonization Commission in Poznan, which is a part of Poland that was primarily Polish. And he sees that you have the German state at the time is trying to transform the demographic character of this region of Poland from Polish to German. And so this inspires Rubin to hire a former German Colonization Commission official to advise the Zionists on how to transform the demographic character of Palestine from Palestinian Arab to Jewish. Max Nordau says at one of the first Zionist congresses, quote, "We will endeavor to do in the Near East what the English did in India." You have also Ze'ev Jabotinsky say basically something similar. He says Britain should create the Jewish state with the same attitude as its other colonization efforts, and it should allow Jews to arm themselves openly against the Arabs, just as white settlers were armed in Kenya. Quote, "Just as blacks were moved to other states, why not move Palestinian Arabs to the surrounding Arab states?" You have Jewish opposition. Now I want to talk a little bit about Jewish opposition to Zionism, and it's coming from a number of places. So first, you have Orthodox opposition to Zionism. You have religious Jews opposed to Zionism because they believe that Jews would gather in the land of Israel only after the coming of the Messiah. So this is a theological debate within Jews. You have these new Jews, the kind of Zionist religious Jews, actually try and reinterpret Jewish law and say, no, Jews should move to Palestine. That will bring about the coming of the Messiah. And that was a rejection of the traditional Jews Jewish view, which was that actually, no, you can't move to Palestine because that is actually trying to engineer the coming of the Messiah. And the coming of the Messiah, according to the traditional halachic view, would only come through divine providence, through divine intervention, not through human action. And so the traditional Jews, they founded an organization in 1912 called Agudat Yisrael, which was opposed to Zionism. And by the way, that organization became essentially the mainstream Haredi political party in Israel today, United for Judaism. And the other reason traditional Orthodox Jews were opposed to Zionism was that it was a secular movement. It had secular principles, secular symbols, secular holidays. It was fundamentally not about Jewish law or Jewish tradition. It was, in fact, opposed to those things because it embraced all of these secular symbols and secular beliefs. Then you had a kind of assimilationist view, which also among the Jewish communities abroad, that basically said, look, this Zionist movement is threatening our status in our own home countries. That was the view of the chief rabbi of Egypt, Chaim Nachum, who spoke out against Zionism throughout the 1940s. That was also the view, by the way, among Jewish communists in Iraq, who founded the Anti-Zionist League in the 1940s. You also had an anti-Zionist league founded in Cairo and Alexandria in 1946. And even in the United States, the Reformed Jewish movement was quite hostile to Zionism throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And then even as late as 1942, you had Reformed Jews in the United States founded an anti-Zionist organization, really at the peak of Jewish suffering in Europe at the time when Jews are being slaughtered by the Nazis in the many millions. You have Jews in the Reformed Jews in the United States saying the best way to guarantee Jewish freedom and Jewish safety is through a democratic society. And that they strongly supported political emancipation, social integration of Jews, as opposed to kind of exclusionary movement, which said, no, Jews need special privileges. And then, as we said, a majority of Jewish immigrants in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were focused on assimilation. And so they were opposed to Zionism. You could say Zionism was a fringe movement in the United States well into the 1910s, 1920s, even as early as 1933. Most American Jews could not be described as Zionists. The major American Jewish Zionist organization had only 65,000 members out of 4.4 million American Jews. So it was still relatively fringe, even as late as the kind of on the eve of Nazi rise to power in Germany. And of course, that changed everything, right? So it was only after Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933 that you really saw Zionism go mainstream in the United States, and it became very mainstream already by the 1940s. Jewish opposition, there was yet another, I would say, strain of Jewish opposition to Zionism, which I think was well encapsulated by a Polish-American historian scholar, Morris Jastrow. And I just love this quote because I think it's such a beautiful encapsulation of a kind of anti-Zionist approach within the Jewish community that I think extends all the way to the present day. Quote, "The presence of so many nationalities in Palestine of today is the all-sufficient argument in favor of creating a Palestinian state, not a Jewish state any more than a Mohammedan state or a Christian state or an Anglo-Saxon state or a Gaelic or Teutonic state. In Palestine, the conditions definitely preclude a state of a single nationality except by forcible submission of the other nationalities already represented," which is an injustice to give the preference to any single group. I mean, talk about prescient. Here we are 4 years later, living the consequences of Morris Jastrow's very prescient remarks in his 1919 book. Let's talk a bit about the internalization of anti-Semitism, which I think was very common among the early Zionist leaders. So you had basically many Zionist leaders internalize these deeply anti-Semitic stereotypes about Jews, right? That's partially why they embraced Zionism. It was to transform the character and nature of world Jewry from weak to strong, from diseased to healthy, from passive to active. And so you have Theodor Herzl in 1897. His most famous text, as we already talked about, was Der Judenstaat. But he also published a very, what I would describe as a very anti-Semitic text called Mashal. And this is a derogatory term used to describe German Jews, basically connoting cheating and insincerity. You might say the closest English equivalent is the word kike today. Herzl believed that Jews who were opposed to Zionism were mashals, who he described as a distortion of human character, unspeakably low and repugnant. In the 1880s, Max Nordau also wrote texts that were replete with anti-Semitic portrayals of the Jews as diseased, especially with leprosy. Zev Jabotinsky had similar things to say about Jews. They were sickly, lacking decorum. And so again, it was precisely because these Zionist leaders internalized this anti-Semitic rhetoric about Jews that is why they were so Zionist. They said we need to transform Jews. We need to change the essence and character of the Jewish people. And so they themselves, of course, they believed these things could be changed, but nevertheless, they internalized all these deeply anti-Semitic things about Jews. I also want to talk briefly about the native Jewish reaction to Zionism in Palestine. So recall that Palestine's Jewish population is something like 5 to 10% of the local population of Palestine on the eve of Zionist immigration. They were half Ashkenazi, half Sephardi, meaning their native languages were roughly half Ladino and then half Yiddish. And it was actually the Ladino speakers, the Sephardi Jews, who also, by the way, spoke Arabic as a second language. It was that community that actually grew quite close to the foreign Zionist community from the 1880s onwards. They shared this goal of strengthening the support in Europe for the Jews of Palestine. Whereas, actually, I would say the Ashkenazi Jewish community in Palestine was more likely to be hostile to the Jewish immigrants, again, owing to the reasons we've discussed, that the traditional halachic view towards establishing a Jewish state in Palestine was that would actually be contrary to halakha or Jewish law, because the Jews are not supposed to take an active role in bringing about the coming of the Messiah. That's something that should be left to divine intervention. I got ahead of myself here. That's this slide here. So as we said, the Ashkenazi Jews, many of them were hostile to the secularism as well. Let's keep moving. So I also want to talk about the Palestinian Arab reaction to Zionism. You have already from the 1880s onwards, you have violence breaking out between Palestinians and Zionist settlers in places like Petah Tikva, Gadara, the Galilee, and the Jezreel Valley. And it's always a similar story. You have Zionist settlers show up to a land that they bought from absentee landlords. They show up and they expel the native inhabitants or they prevent them from grazing on their lands, right? And so so these natives get displaced, their livelihoods are threatened or usurped, and so violence breaks out. So that's what's happening on the ground. And then you have the Palestinian intellectuals like Yusuf Dia Pasha al-Khalidi, pictured here in the bottom right, who writes a letter to Theodor Herzl already in 1899 saying, leave Palestine in peace. And then if you look at the Palestinian Arab newspapers from 1908 to 1914, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of articles talking about Zionism and very critical of Zionism, talking about the threat that this poses to Palestine's native population. You even have discussions of Zionism in the Ottoman parliament. You have Arabs talking about warning the Ottoman state, warning the Ottoman delegates in the Ottoman parliament of this is in 1911, basically saying, look, the influx of Jewish settlers to Palestine is causing harm to the native population. Let's talk about some of these Zionist institutions, and we're going to move through these slides quickly, but what I want to just basically point out here is that the Zionists are establishing institutions of statehood, right? So, you have a land, the Jewish Colonial Trust, you have a Jewish agency, which is basically the executive branch of the Zionist community that is chaired by David Ben-Gurion from 1935 to 1948. The Zionists are also heavily influenced by socialism, right? Because socialism is another response to anti-Semitism, just like Zionism is a response to anti-Semitism. And so it's embraced by Russian Jews because they see socialism as providing them an on-ramp to assimilate into their home societies that they were traditionally excluded from, right? Because socialism says religion is irrelevant. And so a traditional anti-Semitism was a deeply anti-socialist idea. Socialism says we're all equal. Doesn't matter what religion we are. We're all, workers of the world unite. So socialism is very attractive to many of the Jews of Eastern Europe, and so that many embrace Zionism, many also embrace socialism, and so you get this kind of socialist Zionist marriage among the Jews of Eastern Europe. And so they establish a labor union, which really comes to dominate, I would say, kind of Zionist politics and political organizing throughout the 1920s and 30s. 75% of the Jewish workforce are members of the Histadrut, the Jewish labor union. The Jews obviously also established armed forces, the Haganah, which is established already in the 1920s. They received support from the British already in the mid-1930s. Of course, the Palestinian Arabs do not receive, their militant organizations do not receive support from the British, but of course the Zionists do. And then, of course, in the 1940s, what happens after you get this massive revolt against the Zionist community, the Great Arab Revolt of 36 to 39, then the Jews, and what happens as a result of that is the British say, we need to place restrictions on Jewish immigration because this is leading to violence. And so they place restrictions on Jewish immigration, which enrages the Zionist community, who then basically start resorting to terrorism. In their most infamous attack, they blow up the King David Hotel, killing 91 people in 1946. The Jews obviously also established a Jewish National Fund, the JNF, which is still alive and well today. That's founded in 1901 to raise. They go around raising money from all these Jewish communities around the world so that they can buy land in Palestine. Today, the JNF controls about 13% of the land of the state of Israel, and their mission is to develop land for the purposes of settling Jews on it, or for Jewish prosperity, Jewish development. Now let's talk about Zionist settlement in the Ottoman Empire. So recall that the Ottomans had a tradition of accepting Jewish immigrants dating all the way back to the 15th century. I mean, that's why there are so many Jews in the Ottoman Empire in the first place, is because they were escaping the Spanish Inquisition in the 15th century and settling in various places in the Ottoman Empire. But the Ottomans ban Jewish settlement in Palestine in 1881 for obvious reasons, because they are faced with all these nationalist uprisings in Greece and the Balkans, and you have the Armenian nationalists, and so they're saying the last place we want Jews to settle in is Palestine. Palestine, it's because they're worried that Jews will establish a breakaway movement that resembles the breakaway movements in Bulgaria and in Greece and in Serbia, and so they say, Jews, you're welcome to migrate to the Ottoman Empire, just anywhere but Palestine. But of course, they don't actually impose those restrictions. And so Jews end up moving to Palestine on a tourist visa and just overstay their visa and never leave, and there's no enforcement. And so by 1900, you have 25,000 Zionist settlers in Palestine, 5,000 settle into the 20 agricultural colonies, settlements in the coastal plains and the Galilee. But actually, a majority move into cities, right? The Jews are not agriculturalists. The Jewish immigrants, they actually don't really know how to till the soil. And so for the first 20 years of the Zionist movement, they actually hire Palestinian Arabs to do the farm work. Who are willing to work for lower wages and do a much better job anyways, that have more experience and more knowledgeable. And so this actually, leads Achad Ha'am, recall he's the cultural Zionist that we already talked about. He travels to Palestine in the 1890s and observes incredible Zionist contempt for the Palestinian Arab population. He says, quote, the Zionists believe all Arabs are savages of the desert, a people similar to a donkey. They deal with the Arabs with hostility and cruelty, trespass unjustly, beat them shamefully for no sufficient reason. So he sees this kind of mistreatment of the indigenous population, and he warns Zionists, you cannot mistreat the Palestinian Arabs if you're trying to establish a state in their midst. And I would say another thing to point out here is that, the Zionists, they did not see themselves as refugees fleeing persecution. They primarily saw themselves as self-sacrificing pioneers building a Jewish homeland. At least this is until, let's say the 1930s. By 1900, most of the agricultural communists, most of these agricultural communities, sorry about that typo, were poor and stagnant and unattractive to potential settlers. Many of these Zionists, they fell ill from malaria. In fact, many eventually left the agricultural colonies, which were not productive, which were not self-sustaining, and they actually just moved to Palestine's urban centers. And part of the reason was because these settlements were not viable. They were not financially viable, they required support from the outside, from the Rothschilds, and the Rothschild family actually backed up many of these colonies. The crop yields were low. The Zionist immigrants were unskilled in agriculture. And by the way, the Zionists were also accustomed to a higher standard of living that was not afforded to them in these agricultural colonies. In addition to backing financially the settlements themselves, the Rothschilds also hired lobbyists in Ottoman Palestine to lobby the Ottoman governor on behalf of Zionist settlements, for example, to ensure that the Zionist immigrants would not get deported despite having overstayed their tourist visas. The other thing to point out here was that you actually had Ottoman deputies, these are Ottoman Turkish deputies in the Ottoman parliament, accusing the Ottoman state of coming under the influence of the Rothschilds, arguing that wealthy Zionists helped the Ottomans secure loans, and that this is why the Ottoman government was not enforcing the laws around Jewish prohibition, Jewish settlement in Palestine. I'm going to try and move a bit faster because we have a number of slides to get through. So one of the key characteristics of the Zionist movement, really from the second Aliyah onwards, so from the 1904 onwards, was this movement of Hebrew labor that said Jews need to be the ones who are actually tilling the soil themselves. This would redeem themselves. And so you have this kibbutz movement. It's a tactical strategy to guarantee Jewish labor. And so David Ben-Gurion says, without Hebrew labor, there is no way to absorb the Jewish masses. Anyone who does anything to counter the principle of Hebrew labor harms the most precious asset we have for fulfilling Zionism. So the idea is we can no longer hire Arabs. We have to only hire Jews. So this is basically a movement. It really becomes a dominant movement within Zionism that says we will not hire non-Jews as laborers in our agricultural settlements or anywhere else in Palestine for that matter. And this also leads to hostility. We've already talked a bit about the conflict between the Zionist settlers and the indigenous Palestinian Arab inhabitants in places like Petah Tikva and Gadera and Rehovot. You have these violent incidents that break out throughout the 1880s and 90s. This kind of brings us to the Zionism, the Balfour Declaration. And so, recall that the British, they adopt this Balfour Declaration, which basically says we call for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. They believe that by issuing the Balfour Declaration in 1917, that will encourage the Americans to enter the war effort and join the Allied war effort in World War I, owing to the power that the Jews in America have over the American government, right? So it's also partly based on this anti-Semitic belief that Jews control the world. The British conquer Palestine in 1918. They adopt the Balfour Declaration and thus encourage Jewish immigration and Jewish land purchases in Palestine in the 1920s and 30s. And you see here is a graph of Jewish immigration to Palestine from the 1930s onwards, and you see the big spike really beginning with Hitler's rise to power in Germany in 1933. That is when you see the number of immigrants to Palestine going from a few thousand a year to many, many tens of thousands per year in just a couple of years. And I want to just kind of end on basically the Zionist approach to the Arab question as it was known then, right? So you have all these Zionist leaders in the 1890s and 1910s, 20s, and 30s asking the question, how are we going to establish a Jewish state in a land that is 70, 80, 90% non-Jewish, that is 70, 80, 90% Palestinian Arab? And Theodor Herzl, Achad Ha'am, Israel Zangel, Arthur Rupin, Smolensk, almost every single important Zionist leader from the 1890s to the 1940s asked themselves this question. And guess what they settle on? They settle on expulsion, at the time known as transfer, that was the likeliest outcome. That was the most, that was the best chance of realizing the Zionist dream was through forcible transfer. And so Theodor Herzl says in the 1890s in his diary, he says, quote, the process, he says, we shall try to spirit the penniless population across the border, and we must do it quietly. Doing Zionism quietly is important. You don't want people to know this is what we're doing. But ultimately, he says in the 1890s, that is what we must do. Israel Zangel, another important Zionist leader, says the same thing. We must be prepared to either drive out by the sword the tribes in possession, as our forefathers did, He says in 1916, if you wish to give a country to a people without a country, it is foolish to allow there to be two peoples in the country. This can only cause trouble. The Jews will suffer, and so will our neighbors. There can only be one people. In Palestine, Chaim Weizmann, who was the most important Zionist leader in Britain, he says in 1930, a quasi-exchange of populations could be fostered or encouraged based on the Greek and Turkish population exchanges in the aftermath of World War I. Menachem Ushkizin says the same thing. In 1930, he writes, if there are other inhabitants of Palestine, they must be transferred somewhere else. Joseph Weitz is probably the most prominent advocate of the transfer idea. In fact, he leads transfer committees that were established in the 1948 war, where he says, basically, we need to expel the Palestinian Arabs from Palestine. And Ben-Gurion has similar views, where he says in the 1930s, quote, if the Arabs would leave Palestine and Transjordan to the Jews, this could help. As few, he basically, ideally for him, it would be better that as few a number as possible of Arabs would remain in the territory that would be established as a Jewish state. And then, in his diary in December 1947, so already after the 1940 war breaks out, he says, quote, the strategic objective of the Jewish forces was to destroy the urban communities, which were the most organized and politically conscious sections of the Palestinian people. This was not done by house-to-house fighting inside the cities, but by the conquest and destruction of the rural areas surrounding most of the towns. Deprived of transportation, food, and raw materials, the urban communities underwent a process of disintegration, chaos, hunger, which forced them to surrender. And so I'm gonna end there because I realize I've probably already gone over, and I do have more slides, but I do want to make sure we have at least 15 minutes for Q&A. So I will end my screen share there. And I believe we're gonna open it up to Q&A.